The wind that swept through the frontier settlement of Oakhaven carried no promises of salvation, only the harsh, abrasive reality of grit and alkali dust that settled over the wooden structures like a suffocating shroud. Maylene stood at the very edge of the uneven boardwalk, her canvas travel bag gripped so tightly in her hands that her knuckles shone bone-white beneath her sun-browned skin. She had traveled for 7 grueling days on a stagecoach that rattled her bones and bruised her spirit, holding fast to a letter of employment that was supposed to be her anchor in this unforgiving territory. The letter, signed by a Mr. Horace Vance, had promised a lucrative position as a chief bookkeeper for a newly established mercantile, a position that would finally allow her to utilize the extensive education her late father had sacrificed everything to provide. But upon arriving in Oakhaven, as the golden, slanted light of late afternoon began to bleed into the bruised purple of twilight, she had found the address to be an empty, weed-choked lot, and Mr. Horace Vance to be nothing more than a ghost, a name entirely unknown to anyone she asked. The realization had struck her not with a sudden, dramatic blow, but with a slow, suffocating weight that pressed down upon her chest, leaving her stranded in a town that looked upon strangers with eyes narrowed by suspicion and hardened by the relentless sun. She had no money for a return ticket, and the few coins remaining in her coin purse were barely enough to secure a single night in a boarding house, let alone sustenance for the week ahead. The town of Oakhaven was a rough-hewn collection of false front buildings, saloons that spilled sour-smelling laughter into the streets, and a large, imposing bank constructed of imported brick that seemed to mock the poverty of the surrounding structures. Maylene smoothed the front of her modest dark blue dress, a garment that had once been elegant but was now worn shiny at the elbows and hem from months of constant travel and meticulous mending. She possessed a quiet dignity, a way of holding her chin high that spoke of an inner resilience forged in the fires of past grief, but as the shadows lengthened across the dusty thoroughfare, the cold reality of her vulnerability began to seep into her bones. She was an outsider in every possible sense, an educated woman of East Asian descent, standing alone in a territory where the law was often dictated by prejudice and the heavy hand of established power. Driven by the sharp, undeniable ache of hunger, Maylene made her way toward the largest mercantile in town, a sprawling establishment bearing the painted sign of Bartholomew Finch, proprietor. The interior of the store was a chaotic labyrinth of barrels, stacked crates, and hanging tools, smelling strongly of cured leather, roasted coffee, and the metallic tang of kerosene. Behind the polished oak counter stood Bartholomew Finch himself, a man whose superficial pleasantness was betrayed by the cold, calculating nature of his pale blue eyes. He wore a pristine wool waistcoat despite the lingering heat of the day, his plump fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the surface of an open ledger book. As Maylene approached the counter, hoping to purchase a small, affordable measure of dried goods, her eyes, trained by years of meticulous study alongside her merchant father, naturally fell upon the open pages of the ledger. In a mere fraction of a second, her mind processed the columns of figures, and she recognized a glaring, deliberate discrepancy in the arithmetic, a compounded interest charge that violated every standard rule of honest banking and trade. Without thinking, driven by an inherent compulsion for order and correctness, Maylene leaned slightly forward and quietly pointed out the error, her voice soft but unwavering. She did not intend to insult the man, only to offer a correction as one professional to another, a naive assumption born of her sheltered upbringing in her father-counting house. Bartholomew Finch froze, his jovial facade shattering instantly as a flush of dark, angry crimson crept up his thick neck. He slammed the heavy ledger shut with a crack that echoed like a pistol shot through the quiet store, drawing the immediate and hostile attention of the half-dozen patrons browsing the aisles. Finch did not merely dismiss her observation, he launched into a loud, venomous tirade, twisting her innocent action into a malicious accusation. He loudly proclaimed to the listening room that this destitute stranger was a common thief, attempting to distract him with nonsensical lies while her hands drifted toward the cash drawer. The accusation was absurd, a blatant fabrication designed to cover his own fraudulent tracks, but the townspeople of Oakhaven, already primed to distrust outsiders, readily accepted the narrative provided by their wealthiest citizen. Whispers erupted like dry brush catching fire, the patrons circling closer, their faces tight with unwarranted indignation. Maylene took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she refused to cower. She stood her ground, her back straight, attempting to calmly refute the ridiculous charge, but her words were entirely drowned out by Finch's booming theatrical demands for the local sheriff. The situation was spiraling rapidly out of control, the social machinery of the town aligning against her with terrifying speed, threatening to strip her of her freedom over a fabricated slight. The isolation she had felt upon stepping off the stagecoach now morphed into a palpable physical danger, a tightening noose of community prejudice orchestrated by a man terrified of being exposed. From the shadowy recesses of the store, near the displays of heavy iron plows and coiled ropes, a figure detached himself from the gloom. Silas Thorne had been watching the entire exchange with the quiet, unblinking intensity of a hawk observing a field mouse. Silas was a man who inhabited the edges of Oakhaven society by deliberate choice, a respected but heavily guarded landowner whose sprawling cattle ranch, Blackwood Ridge, sat 10 miles outside the town limits. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by sun and sorrow, his dark eyes shadowed by the brim of a battered Stetson. 5 years prior, a sudden and brutal fever had taken his wife, and in the aftermath of that devastating loss, Silas had systematically built high, impenetrable fences around his heart and his life. He spoke rarely, came to town only when absolutely necessary, and possessed a reputation for an uncompromising, almost rigid sense of honor. He had seen the way Finch manipulated the town, and he had seen the genuine, unpanicked intelligence in the strange woman eyes before Finch had begun his hysterical shouting. The boots of Silas Thorne struck the wooden floorboards with a heavy, measured rhythm that somehow managed to cut through the rising clamor of the store. He did not hurry, nor did he swagger. He simply moved with the inevitable force of a changing tide. The crowd instinctively parted for him, the hostile muttering dying down to a nervous silence as he stopped beside Maylin. He did not look at her immediately, but instead fixed his dark, impenetrable gaze directly on Bartholomew Finch. The banker blustered, attempting to maintain his righteous indignation, but his pale eyes flickered with a sudden, unmistakable cowardice. Silas reached into the pocket of his worn leather vest, retrieved a heavy silver dollar, and tossed it onto the polished oak counter, the coin spinning with a bright, ringing sound before settling flat. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. Silas finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried effortlessly to the furthest corners of the mercantile. He stated simply and plainly that the woman was no thief, and that he was paying for whatever goods she required, ending the matter immediately. It was not a request. It was a declaration of fact from a man who held enough land and respect to overrule the petty tyrannies of the local merchant. Finch, recognizing that he could not bully Silas Thorne without risking his own standing, swallowed his venom and offered a tight, insincere smile, sweeping the coin into his till with a trembling hand. The immediate threat of the sheriff and the mob dissolved, leaving a heavy, awkward atmosphere in its wake. Silas turned his attention to Maylin for the first time. He noted the fraying edges of her sleeves, the exhaustion bruised beneath her eyes, and the fierce, unyielding pride that kept her spine rigidly straight despite the ordeal. He did not offer her pity, nor did he offer her charity, knowing instinctively that a woman of her bearing would reject both out of hand. Instead, he recognized an opportunity that served them both. He spoke in a quiet, pragmatic tone, loud enough only for her to hear. He told her that he owned a large operation out at Blackwood Ridge, that his ledgers were a tangled mess he had neither the time nor the inclination to sort, and that his household had suffered greatly from his own neglect. He offered her a position as his bookkeeper and housekeeper, stating a fair monthly wage and the provision of room and board. The offer was entirely transactional, framed as a mutually beneficial arrangement of labor for shelter, carefully designed to preserve her dignity. Maylin looked up into his weathered face, searching his dark eyes for any hidden cruelty or ulterior motive. She found nothing but a profound, almost startling emptiness, a vast emotional landscape that mirrored the desolate plains surrounding the town. She understood the risk of riding out into the wilderness with a stranger, but she also understood the absolute certainty of starvation if she remained in Oakhaven. With a slow, deliberate nod, she accepted his terms, her voice steady as she clarified that she expected to see the ledgers upon arrival. Silas gave a single curt nod in return, turned on his heel, and led the way out of the suffocating confines of the mercantile, leaving a stunned and whispering town behind them. The journey to Blackwood Ridge took over 2 hours in Silas' heavy, springless wagon. The silence between them was profound, but not entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had learned to conserve their energy for survival, two solitary figures moving through a vast, indifferent landscape. The sun finally dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of crimson and burnt orange before fading into a deep, star-studded indigo. Maylin sat stiffly on the wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the silhouettes of scrub oak and sagebrush pass in the gathering gloom. She did not ask questions about his past, and he offered no inquiries about hers. The boundaries of their arrangement were clearly defined by the quiet space they maintained between them on the wagon seat. When they finally crested the final ridge, the ranch house emerged from the darkness. It was a substantial structure of hewn timber and fieldstone, but even in the moonlight, Mei Lin could see the signs of profound neglect. The porch sagged slightly on one side, the windows were clouded with layers of dust, and the surrounding yard was a chaotic tangle of overgrown weeds and discarded, rusting tools. It was a house that had been completely devoid of life and care for a very long time, a physical manifestation of the grief Silas Thorne carried within him. Silas halted the team of massive draft horses, stepped down, and moved to assist her, offering a large, calloused hand. His touch was brief, entirely respectful, and completely devoid of warmth. He led her inside, lighting a single kerosene lantern that cast long, wavering shadows against the bare wooden walls. The interior of the house was sparsely furnished and thick with the stale scent of uncirculated air and cold ashes. Silas pointed out a small, separate room off the main kitchen that would be hers, provided her with a fresh bucket of water from the pump, and retreated to his own quarters without another word. Mei Lin stood alone in the center of the strange, silent house. She did not weep. She unpacked her few meager belongings, washed the dust from her face and hands, and sat on the edge of the narrow iron bed. She had traded the immediate danger of the town for the vast, echoing isolation of the frontier, placing her life in the hands of a man who seemed more stone than flesh. Yet as she lay down and pulled the thin wool blanket over her shoulders, she felt a strange, tentative sense of purpose take root in her chest. She had a task, a role to fulfill, and she intended to execute it with absolute precision. The following morning began before the sun had even considered cresting the eastern hills. Mei Lin rose in the pitch black, her internal clock set by years of disciplined routine. She found the kitchen in a state of disorganized disarray, but the cast iron stove was solid, and the pantry, though disorganized, held sufficient basic supplies. By the time Silas emerged from his room, his boots striking the floorboards with that same measured rhythm, the scent of strong coffee and frying bacon filled the air. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the suddenly clean counters and the neatly arranged table. He said nothing, simply taking his seat and accepting the plate she placed before him. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware and the crackle of the wood fire. It was a methodical, practical start to a partnership built entirely on necessity. Over the next 3 weeks, Mei Lin moved through the house like a quiet, relentless force of nature. She scrubbed the floors until the original grain of the wood shone through, washed the clouded windows until the prairie light flooded the rooms, and brought order to the chaotic tangle of the overgrown kitchen garden. She mended Silas-worn shirts with stitches so tiny and precise they were nearly invisible, and she cooked meals that were simple but seasoned with a care he had not experienced in half a decade. But her most significant impact was found in the small, dusty office at the back of the house. Silas had deposited a wooden crate filled with years of tangled, disorganized ledgers and loose receipts onto the desk, warning her that it was a hopeless endeavor. Mei Lin had simply rolled up her sleeves and begun the painstaking work of unraveling the financial history of Blackwood Ridge. She worked late into the night, the soft yellow glow of the oil lamp illuminating the sharp, focused lines of her face as she traced columns of faded ink. She discovered quickly that Silas Thorne was a man of immense practical skill regarding cattle and land, but he was disastrously indifferent to the intricate mechanics of finance. As she organized the accounts, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the chaotic numbers. The loans Silas had taken from Bartholomew Finch Bank to expand his herd during a drought year were structured with convoluted clauses and compounding interest rates that were designed not to be repaid, but to slowly, inevitably bleed the ranch dry. It was a predatory snare, hidden beneath legal jargon, intended to eventually force a foreclosure and deliver the valuable land directly into Finch-waiting hands. When Mei Lin finally presented her findings to Silas, she did not soften the blow. She laid the neatly rewritten ledgers on the large oak dining table, her fingers tracing the specific fraudulent entries that Finch had buried in the paperwork. Silas listened in silence, his jaw tightening, his dark eyes fixed on the damning numbers. He did not explode in anger. His fury was a cold, internalized thing that settled deeply into his bones. He realized in that moment not only the extent of Finch's treachery, but the immense value of the woman standing before him. She had uncovered a threat that would have destroyed him, utilizing a sharp, analytical intelligence he had entirely underestimated. The respect he felt for her, previously based on her quiet resilience and hard work, deepened into a profound, undeniable admiration. The dynamic between them began to subtly shift. The silence that filled the spaces of the house was no longer the heavy, guarded silence of two strangers, but a comfortable, shared quietness. Silas began to linger longer over his evening coffee, watching the way the lamplight caught the dark sheen of her hair as she read or sewed. He found himself seeking her opinion not just on the ledgers, but on matters of the ranch, the purchase of new seed, the timing of the spring gather. He listened to her, truly listened, valuing her practical, unsentimental perspective. He noticed the way her hands, though calloused from labor, moved with a fluid, inherent grace. The high fences he had built around his life were not being torn down by force, but they were slowly, imperceptibly being dismantled by the steady, capable presence of Maylin. However, the peace they were building was fragile, and word of Silas Thorne's sudden financial reorganization inevitably reached the ears of Bartholomew Finch. The banker, realizing that his carefully laid trap was being dismantled, grew desperate and dangerous. He could not attack Silas directly on legal grounds, as Maylin's meticulous bookkeeping had exposed the vulnerabilities in his own contracts. Instead, Finch resorted to the coward tactics of social pressure and intimidation. He began to spread vicious rumors through the town of Oakhaven, questioning the morality of the living arrangement at Blackwood Ridge. He suggested, with a superficially polite but deeply venomous tone, that an unmarried woman of questionable background living alone with a widower was a blight upon the decency of the community. He used his influence to delay shipments of supplies meant for the ranch, and he quietly encouraged the more unsavory elements of the town to make their hostility known. The tension escalated from whispered gossip to direct threats. One afternoon, while Silas was miles away repairing a distant boundary fence, 3 rough-looking men, known associates of Finch, rode into the yard of Blackwood Ridge. They did not dismount, but sat their horses near the porch, their eyes roaming disrespectfully over the property and over Maylin, who stood on the steps holding a basket of laundry. They spoke in veiled, menacing terms about the dangers of the frontier for a woman without proper protection, suggesting that she should pack her bags and leave before the town decided to take matters into its own hands. Maylin did not flinch, nor did she retreat into the house. She stood perfectly still, her posture radiating a cold, dignified defiance, and informed them in a voice like cracked ice that they were trespassing on private land and had exactly 10 seconds to turn their horses around before she retrieved the shotgun resting inside the door. The men, unnerved by her total lack of fear, spat into the dust and rode off, but the underlying threat hung heavy in the air. When Silas returned and learned of the incursion, a dangerous, quiet rage settled over him. He did not shout or curse, but he spent the evening cleaning and oiling his rifle with a meticulous, terrifying focus. He realized that Finch was not simply trying to steal his land. He was targeting Maylin, using her as leverage to break Silas' resolve. The realization ignited a protective instinct within him that he thought had died with his wife. He told Maylin, his voice low and tight, that she was safe under his roof, and that no man from Oakhaven would ever set foot on his land again without facing the consequences. Maylin looked at him, seeing the fierce, uncompromising loyalty in his eyes, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt a profound sense of security. She knew with absolute certainty that this quiet, hardened man would stand between her and the world. The conflict reached its inevitable, violent climax during the dry, breathless heat of late August. The prairie grass was like tinder, and the wind blew in hot, restless gusts. In the dead of night, Maylin was awakened by the frantic, terrified screaming of the horses in the main barn. She threw off her blankets, the smell of acrid smoke instantly stinging her nostrils. She did not wait for Silas. She pulled on her boots, grabbed a heavy wool blanket, and sprinted across the dark yard toward the glow of flames licking at the rear wall of the wooden structure. Finch hired men had returned, cowardly striking in the dark, intending to destroy the livestock and the winter feed, crippling the ranch permanently. Maylin threw open the heavy barn doors, coughing as the thick black smoke billowed outward. The interior was a chaotic nightmare of heat and panic. The flames were rapidly consuming the dry hay in the rear stalls, and the 4 massive draft horses were rearing and kicking in their enclosures, maddened by terror. Without a second thought for her own safety, Maylin soaked the wool blanket in the large water trough near the entrance, threw it over her head and shoulders, and plunged into the stifling heat. She moved with desperate speed, throwing the latches on the stalls and using her voice, sharp and commanding, to drive the panicked animals toward the open doors. The heat seared her lungs, and a falling ember caught the sleeve of her dress, but she slapped it out with a bare hand, refusing to retreat until the last horse had bolted to safety. Only then did she remember the ledgers. The wooden crate containing all the evidence of Finch fraud was stored in a small tack room adjacent to the burning stalls. She turned back, diving beneath a falling beam, the smoke blinding her. She found the heavy crate, her fingers finding the rope handles, and dragged it with all her remaining strength toward the exit. She stumbled out into the cool night air just as the roof of the rear section collapsed in a shower of sparks. She collapsed onto the dusty ground, gasping for air, her hands blistered and her face covered in soot, but her grip on the crate remained ironclad. Silas, who had been fighting the fire from the exterior with a bucket brigade of one, dropping his tools when he saw the roof give way, ran toward her with a terror he had not felt in years. He dropped to his knees beside her in the dirt, his large hands frantically checking her shoulders, her arms, her face for serious injury. His breath was ragged, his usual stoic composure entirely shattered by the thought of losing her to the flames. He saw the burns on her hands, the singed edges of her hair, and the triumphant, exhausted gleam in her eyes as she patted the wooden crate. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath, as the remaining embers glowed in the darkness, they sat together on the porch steps. Silas carefully wrapped her blistered hands in clean linen, coated with a soothing salve he had fetched from the house. His touch, usually so brief and guarded, was incredibly gentle, his fingers lingering against her skin. The silence between them was no longer just comfortable. It was thick with unspoken emotion, heavy with the weight of near loss. Silas looked down at her hands, his voice barely a whisper when he finally spoke. He confessed, the words tearing out of his throat like jagged stones, that he had spent 5 years trying to feel nothing, believing that caring for anything in this harsh world was simply a rope that turned out to be a noose. He told her about the paralyzing grief of watching his wife die, and his vow to never allow himself to be that vulnerable again. Maylin listened, the throbbing pain in her hands fading beneath the intensity of his confession. She did not offer him platitudes or pity. She leaned her head slightly against his shoulder, a profound gesture of comfort and shared survival. She spoke quietly of her own losses, of the father who had taught her to be strong, and the terrifying realization of being utterly alone in the world. They sat together in the darkness, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes, two solitary people who had been battered by the world, finding a profound, undeniable anchor in one another. The high fences had not just been dismantled, they had been burned to the ground, leaving nothing but the raw, honest truth of their connection. The next morning, as the sun rose over the blackened ruins of the barn, Silas Thorne did not begin rebuilding. Instead, he hitched the surviving horses to the wagon, helped Maylin onto the seat, and loaded the heavy wooden crate of ledgers into the back. His face was set in lines of granite, his purpose absolute. They drove the 10 miles into Oakhaven in silence, but it was the silence of two people moving as a single, unified force. They arrived in town just as the morning traffic was at its peak, pulling the wagon directly in front of the imposing brick facade of the bank. Silas stepped down, retrieved his rifle from the boot, and held it casually but firmly at his side, a clear warning against any interference. He then assisted Maylin down, carrying the heavy crate of ledgers himself. They walked together onto the wide wooden porch of the general store, directly across from the bank, where a crowd was already beginning to gather, drawn by the grim determination radiating from the rancher. Bartholomew Finch, standing behind the glass window of his bank, saw them and turned the color of old parchment. He attempted to lock the doors, but Silas crossed the street with long, purposeful strides, kicking the heavy oak door open before the deadbolt could slide into place. He dragged Finch out onto the boardwalk by the collar of his pristine waistcoat, ignoring the man's sputtering protests, and threw him roughly onto the dusty street in front of the gathered townspeople. Silas did not shout. He spoke in that same, low, carrying rumble, but his words were laced with a cold, devastating authority. He announced to the town that Bartholomew Finch had ordered the burning of his property, attempting to destroy the evidence of a massive, systematic fraud that targeted not just Blackwood Ridge, but half the ranches in the valley. He gestured to Maylin, who stood calmly on the porch, her bandaged hands resting on the open crate of ledgers. With precise, devastating clarity, Maylin began to read the figures aloud, exposing the hidden clauses, the altered interest rates, and the illegal seizures of land that Finch had orchestrated over the past decade. She named names, dates, and exact amounts, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the crowd like a surgical blade. The townspeople, many of whom owed their own crippling debts to Finch, listened in rising, furious shock. The superficial respectability of the banker was stripped away in minutes, revealing the cowardly, predatory creature beneath. The local sheriff, a man who usually turned a blind eye to Finch dealings, stepped forward, reading the dangerous mood of the crowd, and placed a heavy hand on Finch's shoulder, effectively placing him under arrest for fraud and arson. The power dynamic of Oakhaven shattered and realigned in a single morning. The town, which had once looked upon Mei Lin with suspicion and hostility, now stared at her with a profound, grudging respect. She had done what none of them had the courage or the intelligence to do. She had brought down the tyrant. With the threat neutralized and Finch being hauled toward the small jailhouse, the crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves. Silas and Mei Lin were left standing alone in the center of the dusty street. Silas turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. The tension of the confrontation drained out of him, replaced by a quiet, profound certainty. He did not care about the town, or the murmurs, or the social conventions of Oakhaven. He cared only about the woman standing before him, the woman who had saved his livelihood, his home, and his soul. Right there, in the middle of the thoroughfare, with the dust still settling around their boots, Silas Thorne slowly lowered himself down onto one knee. It was not a gesture of subservient passion, but a deliberate public declaration of honor and respect. He looked up at Mei Lin, ignoring the few lingering townspeople who stopped and stared in open-mouthed shock. He spoke plainly, his voice steady and clear. He stated that he had offered her an arrangement born of necessity, a trade of labor for shelter. But he now recognized that his life, his ranch, and his future were entirely empty without her presence. He did not offer flowery poetry or wild promises. He offered his name, his land, and his unwavering loyalty. He asked her to stay at Blackwood Ridge, not as a housekeeper, not as a bookkeeper, but as an equal partner. He asked her to be his wife. Mei Lin looked down at the hardened, honorable man kneeling in the dust. She saw the vulnerability he had entrusted only to her, the quiet strength that anchored him, and the deep, abiding respect that formed the foundation of his proposal. She did not blush or turn away coyly. She met his gaze with her own clear, intelligent eyes, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking across her face, softening the harsh lines of her past grief. She reached out with her bandaged hands, resting them gently on his broad shoulders, and gave her answer in a voice that was soft but strong enough to be heard by anyone who cared to listen. She said yes, accepting the partnership, the man, and the future they had earned together. She asked him to stand, and he did, his large hand enveloping hers, pulling her close to his side as they turned back toward the wagon, leaving the stunned town of Oakhaven behind them. A full year passed, the relentless cycle of seasons turning the harsh frontier landscape from the brittle brown of winter to the vibrant, chaotic green of spring. The ranch at Blackwood Ridge had undergone a transformation as profound as the people who lived there. The burned ruins of the old barn had been cleared away, replaced by a massive, sturdy structure of fresh pine that smelled of pitch and new beginnings. The sagging porch had been repaired and expanded, the chaotic yard transformed into a flourishing, ordered garden that provided fresh vegetables and bright, defiant flowers. The ledgers, now kept in a pristine office with a new glass window, showed a ranch that was not merely surviving, but actively prospering, free from the suffocating debt of the past. The town of Oakhaven had changed as well. With Finch disgraced and his assets seized by the territorial courts, a new, fairer economy had taken root. The townspeople who had once shunned Mei Lin now greeted her with polite nods and deferential respect when she rode into town for supplies. They recognized her not as the destitute outsider, but as Mrs. Thorne, a woman of formidable intellect and undeniable character. Harriet Miller, the owner of the local boarding house and one of the few who had silently disapproved of Finch tyranny, had even become a regular visitor to the ranch, bringing news and sharing tea on the newly built porch. The isolation of Blackwood Ridge was no longer a fortress against a hostile world, but a peaceful sanctuary. As the sun began its slow descent on a warm evening in late summer, painting the vast western sky in brilliant shades of gold and violet, Silas and Mei Lin sat together on the wide front porch. The day labor was done, the horses were settled in the new barn, and the quiet contentment of the evening settled over the land. Silas sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair, his boots propped against the railing, a cup of dark coffee resting on his knee. He looked out over his land, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, and then turned his head to look at his wife. Mei Lin sat beside him, a ledger resting closed on her lap, her hands, long healed from the fire, resting quietly over the leather cover. The silence between them was deep, resonant, and entirely complete. It was the silence of two people who understood every shadow and every light within each other, a silence built on shared hardship, mutual respect, and a quiet, enduring love. Silas reached out, his calloused fingers finding hers, intertwining them with a gentle strength. He did not need to speak to convey the profound gratitude he felt for the day she had stepped off that stagecoach, armed with nothing but her intelligence and her unbreakable spirit. Maylin squeezed his hand in return, leaning her head back against the chair, closing her eyes as the cool evening breeze swept across the porch. They had both arrived at this place broken by the world, but together they had built a life that was solid, prosperous, and fiercely their own. The ranch stood as a testament to their partnership, a thriving, peaceful domain secured by the strength of their bond, a future earned in the dust and the fire, now bathed in the golden, lasting light of peace.